The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to Repro Action's Act and Learn webinar for September 2023. We're very excited about this month's important topic, survivor justice on and off campus. So we'll start with an introduction of your hosts. First voice you're hearing is Erin Matson. Hello, I use she, her pronouns. I'm co-founder and executive director of Repro Action. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm still on whatever that site is called nowadays at Erin to the Max. And I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Hello, everyone. I am Jessica Ensley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Digital Outreach and Opposition Research Director here at Repro Action, and I'm based out of Washington, D.C. And I'm super excited to be going over this topic today.
Thank you. So a quick spin through our agenda. First, we'll introduce Repro Action. Then we'll introduce the topic of survivor justice. We are so excited about the panel discussion today. We are joined by Emma Tennant, who's a student at George Washington University. We are joined by Elizabeth Tang from the National Women's Law Center, and we're joined by Charlie Chadwick from F Rape Culture. What a powerful panel. Can't wait to hear from them. Then we're going to go through next steps and Q&A. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. One, if you are on Twitter and you want to live tweet, please join the conversation by live tweeting and just put on the hashtag ReproAction with it, so it's easy for other folks to see it. And it's also easy for us to retweet you then. Also, if you have any questions for our panelists, for Jessica, for anyone, just put them in the questions tab and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So you don't have to wait until the end to start putting those in, but we'll get to as many as possible at the end. All right, just briefly about Repro Action. So Repro Action leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are deeply proud of our left flank analysis. We are known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they are traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And we absolutely stand with survivors of sexual assault. So I will pass it over to Jessica to get us started on this topic.
Thank you so much, Erin. And yes, the topic today is sensitive, so just a warning for folks about that. And if you need to leave at any point, that is totally okay. We record all of these and put them up on our YouTube channel after, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So to dive in, I'm going to start by going over some definitions so we're on the same page. So first up, we have sexual violence. That is an all-encompassing non-legal term that refers to crimes like sexual assault, rape, and sexual abuse. Sexual assault is defined as sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the victim. Includes attempted rape, unwanted sexual touching, etc. Then we have rape, which is a form of sexual assault, but not all sexual assault is rape. The term rape is often used as a legal definition to specifically include sexual penetration without consent. Then there's sexual abuse, which in criminal law, any act of sexual contact that a person suffers, submits to, participates in, or performs as a result of force or violence, threats, fear, or deception, or without having legally consented to the act. Force is another term, so that is physical or emotional pressure, coercion, or manipulation. And then we have sexual harassment, which is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go over this discussion of the terms victim versus survivor. So according to RAINN, the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization, they had this to say when referring to folks who suffer from any type of sexual violence as victims or survivors. Quote, both terms are applicable RAIN tends to use the term victim when referring to someone who has recently been affected by sexual violence, when discussing a particular crime, or when referring to aspects of the criminal justice system. We often use survivor to refer to someone who has gone through the recovery process, or when discussing the short or long-term effects of sexual violence. Some people identify as victim, while others prefer the term survivor, and the best way is to be respectful and to ask for their preference. For context, I am a survivor of sexual assault. I prefer the term survivor, but if I'm referring to the very specific event that occurred when I was 19, I will say I was a victim of sexual violence. So that's my preference, but like I just mentioned, RAIN suggests if someone is trusting you enough to discuss it, and you hear that they're using particular terminology, it's best to go with that or just to ask them. Next slide. All right, now we're going to go over statistics on sexual violence. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. People ages 12 to 34 at the highest risk of sexual assault. 1 in 6 American women will be a victim of rape or attempted rape in her lifetime. 82% are juvenile victims are female. 90% of adult rape victims are female. 1 in 33 men will be a victim of rape or attempted rape in his lifetime, and 1 out of every 10 rape victims are men. Next slide. So these are continued statistics. 21% of transgender, genderqueer, and non-conforming college students have been sexually assaulted, compared to 18% of non-TGQN females and 4% of non-TGQN males. Native Americans are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to all races. For sexual violence against inmates, 60% is perpetuated by jail or prison staff. Nearly 99% of all sexual violence perpetrators are male, and only 2% of rapists are convicted or in prison. So these statistics really are showing that the most marginalized communities are at higher risk of being victims of sexual violence. All right, and now we're going to move on to our lovely panel. So first up, we have Emma Tennant. So Emma, her is a junior at George Washington University studying public policy and economics and minoring in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, Emma transplanted her passion for women's rights in high school to immersing herself in the fight for reproductive justice and survivor justice on her campus. Working with Foggy Bottom Plan B, an organization providing free and confidential emergency contraception on campus and the broader community, and acting as VP of Peer Educators for Students Against Sexual Assault, an organization aimed at having peer-to-peer education on preventing sexual violence on GW's campus. She has intertwined the mission of both organizations to find meaningful pathways towards greater access to the resources available to survivors on campus. Also acting as the Access Chair for GW's RAGE, which is a reproductive autonomy gender equity organization, Emma centers on reproductive justice as a framework for survivor justice work, as well as guidance for how to push change in the way and what resources are provided on campus. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today. It is lovely to have you. So the first question that we have for you is, how did you initially get involved with activism on campus?
Yes, and I just wanted to say I'm really happy to be here and to be involved in this conversation that we're having. So in terms of how I've gotten involved with activism on campus, as GW is in the heart of downtown DC, there's a lot of various pathways and ways to get involved with activism, whether that's joining a group of friends to go to the Supreme Court to petition and protest, or just local petitions and protests on campus. My first contact with activism on campus came with a couple of student organizations that were just previously mentioned, such as RAGE. And as getting involved with that, I kind of was led to being involved with like a cohort of students that were all kind of led into a direction of focusing on accessibility and improved resources around reproductive health and justice on campus. So with that, that kind of led to involvement with Foggy Bottom Plan B and SASA, which is Students Against Sexual Assault. And being involved with all these students, it kind of cultivated a a very innovative way to tackle these issues, as we all came from different levels of education around sexual violence, reproductive justice, and other frameworks from high school. So in these different organizations, and especially with a good cohort and great group of people to be involved with, I found that these organizations kind of reinforced each other, and that they provided resources to help each other and like worked in tandem with each other. So it was honestly a very non-linear way to get involved with activism, whether it be just attending a general body meeting during the week at school, like after classes, or if it meant meeting up with them on the weekends to talk about a project, and they open the invite to anyone on campus involved. They'll open it up to faculty, and they'll open it up to other resources on campus that help with the specific mission that we're going for. So, like I said, not a very linear way, and there's a lot of different avenues to get involved with activism. But in trying to get a little bit more involved and heighten my level of how I wanted to see things change on campus, I would say that a different student organization I was involved with hosted a workshop that Students Against Sexual Assault does, which is a peer education workshop, and it is a peer-to-peer perspective of how to prevent sexual violence on campus, and it involves a lot of education around different definitions, what it means in DC, some legal definitions, and it also heavily focuses on the resources on campus and the different ways to go and access these resources. So I was very intrigued just as an attendee of this workshop and looking up to these people that are only a year older than me, but they're talking to me as if we were having a sit-down conversation. They highly recommended engagement and highly recommended conversation within a large group of people around this topic. And they were very transparent about the gaps that were apparent for survivors on campus and those who experience sexual violence on campus. So after this meeting and after this workshop, I asked, like, how do you formulate these these education sessions? And so they just talked about how they're bringing survivor justice into the conversation about preventing sexual violence, and how the incorporation of survivor justice should be a main focus for resources on campus as well. So I'll end on the fact that involvement in activism was largely people-centered, and just being able to interact with all these different types of people and having a very warm and inviting culture of activism on GW's campus. And it definitely, I will add that there was a huge post-COVID effect, as I'm a rising junior, so I started school right after COVID. And there was a large surge of people wanting to get involved with activism of all different kinds. But I will say SASA and RAGE and Foggy Bottom Plan B are all these kind of organizations that work around and with each other, and they very much want to encourage participation and encourage people to step up and be able to interact with the university as a whole, whether that's other students or leaders or faculty, in making change and advocating for that change.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those. That leads me to my next question for you. What do you think are some of the major barriers for survivor justice that you're seeing on the GW campus? And do you think other universities are having similar or different issues?
Yeah, so I will say I think the major barrier for survivor justice on campus is that gap I was talking about between what kids are coming to campus and what knowledge they have of either like specific definitions of what encompasses sexual violence, legal definitions, and also that gap of students not knowing the resources that are on campus, whether it be more counseling support, whether legal support, whether it be academic support for any of those who have experienced sexual violence. And yeah, so I think that barrier of not knowing what is available to them, and all freshmen coming to GW must go to an event that covers the resources related to sexual violence, including Title IX and our Office of Advocacy and Support. And that is the only real interaction that they'll have for their entirety of their college career on GW, learning and knowing these resources. So I will say that barrier of not knowing, not being reminded constantly of the as we looked at those statistics, the highly active threat of sexual violence on our campus. And so that is where Students Against Sexual Assault kind of stepped in and said this should be an ongoing conversation, and it should be an ever-changing conversation as statistics are showing a larger portion of LGBTQ students encountering sexual violence. And this conversation should be always talked about. And we come in and try to fill that gap and fill that barrier of resources, because as students that may experience sexual violence, they are more likely to interact with these resources that are available to them, but they're less likely to if they're not fully educated or not know the right path or feel like they don't have a support system behind them. And that goes in saying that DC, and being a college in DC, there are a multitude of outside organizations, as well as I am very lucky to say that there are multiple services and support systems on campus that are here to help students. And I cannot go without recognizing that other campuses must struggle with this gap between education on preventing sexual violence and educating on the resources that can be used to treat survivors and to educate peers, as many outside organizations may not be available in all campuses. So in that, the support network between other student organizations, the university, and local organizations have really reinforced this conversation on campus of breaking down that barrier to whether it be fear of the perpetrator or fear of getting behind in classes or legal support that can be costly or accessing hospital needs and resources that involve that. And so I feel that that barrier is going to exist no matter whether it's in the heart of a city that highly encourages the conversation and encourages interaction with these resources versus a rural campus where it is taboo to talk about sexual violence, and it's taboo to go after perpetrators, and there is no support network in university faculty or staff at all to support those who experience sexual violence. So I believe that the barrier it's hard to tackle, as SAS is trying to make the conversation at a peer-to-peer level, and having students who have experienced sexual violence on campus interact with these the offices of support and Title IX resources, and trying to encourage more student organizations and other groups such as Greek Life, such as sports, and other groups to have these resources available to all of their members, as well as encourage the university to make sure that the resources are available. And I don't want to say that we are the standard, but I would hope that other campuses should look to filling this gap between education and the resources like I talked about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think that pretty much answered the next question that I had for you. But just real quick, what would you tell a fellow student who came up to you and asked like how to get involved to preventing or to helping survivor justice on campus?
Yeah, I definitely think I probably touched on that a little bit, but I definitely would say like finding that group, that cohort that I was talking about in the beginning that kind of touches all the aspects such as like activism and resources, education, and kind of finding your niche within all of that and intertwining those student organizations so there's a better support system and a better movement behind making survivor justice a major staple of the conversation around sexual violence. So bringing advocacy off campus, onto campus, and reaching out to those organizations that exist that could help campuses all across the country, no matter where they are, to bring about survivor justice on campus.
Wonderful. Emma, thank you so much. And I will pass it over to Erin for our next panelist.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Emma. I am delighted to introduce our next panelist, Elizabeth Tang, who's Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center, where she focuses on ending sex-based harassment, including sexual assault, dating, violence, and stalking in schools through Know Your Rights, education, policy advocacy, and litigation. She's also advocated for the rights of LGBTQI+ students, including transgender and non-binary students in school athletics. Prior to law school, she interned at the ACLU and the U.S. Senate and worked at the APNI AAP Women's Collective, an organization serving sex workers and their children in Mumbai. Elizabeth served as the former chair of NWLC United's bargaining committee and led her union to its first contract with NWLC. Outside of work, she served as a legal observer with the National Lawyers Guild and a community organizer with several socialist and abolitionist organizations in DC to defund the police, create non-carceral safety responses, and support residents harmed by immigration detention. Elizabeth received her JD from the University of Pennsylvania and her bachelor's from Harvard College. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Always a delight to speak with you. So, first question for you, Jessica. Elizabeth, can you give our audience an overview of what Title IX is, who it applies to, and how it can be used to advocate for survivors of sexual assault on campus?
Yeah, absolutely. Title IX has meant a lot of different things to different people. A lot of people think it only applies to sports, or just don't know the full extent of it. Or they think it only applies to, say, sexual assault. Title IX is actually very broad. It is a federal law that says that schools that receive federal funding cannot discriminate based on sex. And it applies to any person. You know, the text of the statute says no person shall be discriminated based on sex, ... And so that means that it protects not only students, but also employees, applicants, people who are candidates in a job interview, visitors on campus, guest speakers, really anyone, no person. So it's very broad. The piece about federal funding, so that applies to obviously all public schools in K-12 and in higher education. It also applies to any private school that receives federal money, whether it's through a Pell Grant, which is basically almost every private university, or you might have a private K-12 school that receives federal money for books or their lunch program, or et cetera. Recently, a lot of schools received federal loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still in right now. But a lot of schools did receive those loans, and they were then subject to Title IX if they received a loan and had not paid back the loan yet. So, check out, what your school's funding sources come from. If they got a PPP loan, if they're a public school, they definitely have to prohibit discrimination based on sex, and there might be many other ways that they might receive federal money. Now, one of the things that Title IX prohibits is sexual harassment and sexual assault, because those are forms of sex discrimination. So under Title IX, your school has to address sex-based harassment, and one of the ways that they do that is having somebody called a Title IX coordinator. The Title IX coordinator is a person whose job is to make sure your school is complying with the federal law. And so if you report that you've experienced sex-based harassment, which includes sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, If you report that you've experienced any of these things, then you have a right to 2 things. So if you walk away from, this portion of the webinar with only 2 facts, what I want you to remember is that if you report sex-based harassment, you have a right to supportive measures and to an investigation if you want one. So what are supportive measures? So earlier on this call, Emma talked about the need for students to know what resources are available to them. Supportive measures are things that your school can offer to help you feel safe and to learn. So for example, if you have experienced harassment and you don't feel safe in your school environment, your school can offer to change your harasser schedule in their classes, or to give them a different hallway route, or to assign them to a different lunch period, or to take a different bus, or maybe to sit at the front of the bus or the back of the bus away from you. Basically, a safety plan so that you don't have to be around your harasser. This includes even a one-way no contact order, meaning a no contact order that tells your harasser to stay away from you, but only applies to them and does not also apply to you. If your harasser is a student employee, your school might supervise them in activities where they're interacting with other students. If the person is a full-on staff member, they could be put on administrative leave during an investigation. If the person is not a student or a staff member, your school can simply ban them from campus. So there's just a lot of ways for your school to ensure your safety if you want supportive measures. Now, you can also ask for academic measures, academic supportive measures. So if you need extra time on your homework or to take a test, if you didn't do well on an assignment or did really badly on an exam because you were experiencing trauma, maybe you had to sit next to your rapist or your abuser, you can ask for a chance to redo your assignment or retake a test. You can get extra tutoring. You might ask for an excused absence. If you need to drop out of a class and later retake it again, your school should allow you to do that without forcing you to pay tuition twice. If you need to take classes remotely, your school can either, record the class for you, offer you Zoom participation. There's just so many ways for your school to accommodate you. And if you, let's say your grades have dropped a little bit, or your attendance has dropped, the number of credits you're taking has dropped, your school should still be preserving you eligibility for any honors or activities or scholarships that have a GPA or credit or attendance requirement, because it's really important that you are not punished for the assault or harassment and then lose your scholarship or honors. So all of that is really important, and supportive measures are available to you as long as you report the harassment. You do not have to ask for an investigation to get supportive measures. That's so important. So I'm going to say that again. You do not have to have an investigation in order to get supportive measures. Now, if you want an investigation, you can ask for one. Your school needs to do that for you right away. And they have to do that even if there's a separate police investigation. But again, the 2 things that you need to know are supportive measures and an investigation if you want one. So I'll stop right there with that. And I want to say National Women's Law Center has a really helpful FAQ on supportive measures that's on our website. I can share the link with you all, as well as a resource on how schools can support survivors as much as possible while still complying with the current Trump Title IX regulations.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. And I feel a much deeper understanding of Title IX having just listened to you just now. And we will share out those links as well in our follow-up email that's going to go out to our full list. So that's great. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat right now that should go out to another toolkit I'm going to mention, which is, oops, it looks like that was a slightly bad link. I apologize for that. I was suspicious of that .p at the end. All right, let's try that. Nope, still not getting it. Okay, I'm going to do it. Jessica, if you can put that link in the chat for me, that would be really helpful. So National Women's Law Center also put together, which you had a key role in as well, a wonderful toolkit in support of survivors of sexual assault, and specifically on this issue of knowing about defamation lawsuits and other retaliation by and for people speaking out about sex-based harassment, which is a huge issue. We are coming pretty close up on time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for our next panelist. But if you could share a top line, like #1 takeaway for people, and then everyone please check out that link, and Jessica put the good one in the chat. Thank you for that, Jessica.
Yeah, so basically we wrote this toolkit. It's called Survivors Speaking Out, a toolkit about defamation lawsuits and other retaliation by and for people speaking out about sex-based harassment. We wrote it along with students, survivors, advocates, including lawyers. But basically the questions were questions that student survivors had when they wanted to speak out and what they wish they would have known at that time about the retaliation, including defamation lawsuits that they faced. And so we started with those questions and then worked backwards to write out the answers to answer what these survivors wish they would have known at that time. There's so much retaliation that survivors face when they want to speak out. Schools, will often suspend or expel survivors that come forward. Employers often will fire or demote them. A lot of times schools and employers alike will tell survivors that they will be punished if they speak publicly about the abuse that they face. And then with defamation lawsuits, even if the harasser or the abuser doesn't expect to win the defamation lawsuit, they will often increasingly sue their victims to prevent them from speaking out or to punish them from having spoken out, as a way to further the cycle of abuse. And even the threat of a defamation lawsuit can be enough for a survivor to then say, well, you know what, maybe I shouldn't say anything. I can't afford this. Even though I know that I spoke the truth, I can't afford the time and the energy and the money to defend myself for, potentially multiple years. And so, what our goal here in creating the toolkit was to make sure that survivors know about their rights, their risks, and their different options in how to speak out. Speaking out is a very personal decision, and what we wanted to do is empower survivors with the information that they needed to make the most informed decision for themselves. They might decide, I do want to speak out. I want to name my experience. I want to reclaim my power. I want to protect my community, prevent this from happening to other people. This is a part of my healing journey, right? There are many reasons for doing that. Or they might decide, actually at this time, given my personal situation, this is not the best option for me. So our goal was to help people make an informed decision, and whatever you end up deciding to do, we absolutely support you. We will drop the link to the toolkit in the chat as well. And, please reach out if you have any questions about speaking out.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of expertise with people on this webinar and the long legacy that this webinar will leave as a recording on YouTube, where we have a lot of viewers. And through our email list. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Deeply appreciate that. And I'm going to pass it back to Jessica to introduce our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Erin. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce our last panelist of today, Charlie Chadwick. Charlie started their work in violence prevention and advocacy in 2013 as a student activist at Ohio University when they co-founded F-Rape Culture in response to the mistreatment of survivors on campus. FRC is a grassroots student activist group created to challenge, undermine, and eradicate rape culture at OU. Since then, they've continued their work in violence prevention and advocacy in Colorado, Iowa, and Ohio, focusing on serving rural communities. And I am so glad to have them on today because not only did I get my activism in FRC, but I do want to note to everyone too that the only reason we aren't fully saying the name of the organization is because of YouTube's terrible guidelines, of which all of our webinars get posted on afterwards. So that is the only reason, but a lot of love to FRC. And Charlie, thank you so much for joining us. My first question for you is, what led you to co-found FRC, and what work have you done in the community since to support survivors of sexual violence?
Hey, thank you so much, Jessica. I'm so excited to be here. I think it is just such a delight that we get to continue to work together in this capacity when we got started together organizing with FRC. So I did want to give a quick disclaimer at the beginning. I have continued my career in sexual violence prevention and advocacy, but because of some recent restrictions and limitations on what I'm able to speak about, I'm speaking today exclusively on my role in community organizing, not as a representative of the organization I currently work for. So with that being said, I'll jump in on the question. I think like many folks who get involved in sexual violence activism and advocacy, a lot of what led me to this work was deeply personal experiences and really observing common themes and experiences shared among all of my friends and family members. And then, when I came to OU and started meeting other people and being exposed to a different way to having these conversations, taking women, gender, and sexuality studies courses, meeting people within those courses who are a little further developed in their activism than I was, I really started to become more acutely aware of these different systems and how they were not only negatively impacting survivors, but also reinforcing some of the behaviors and that allow this type of violence to continue. And this really came to a head when I believe it was fall of 2013, we received an all campus safety email that gave a brief description of the situation and then was followed up with some safety instructions. And the situation was a young woman was intoxicated at a party, asked a friend to walk her home. After the party, that friend then went on to assault her. And the safety instructions that they included within that email were don't drink too much, don't walk home alone at night, call a friend if you're drunk and need assistance getting home, which was, a pretty glaring contradiction from that situation and the recommendations that they were giving. So that started a pretty intense outcry of this is absurd, like this is not actually creating community safety, this is causing confusion, blaming the victim, and also not being realistic about who typically is perpetuating sexual violence. We now know that the stranger danger is not accurate and that typically sexual violence is being perpetrated by someone the victim knows. And so all of these things really came together after that email. And so we decided that we had an opportunity that we, not just folks who may have been in the activist spaces already, but that there was a lot of interest and engagement from campus wide. So we started connecting with folks and started FRC, and that really got me involved into what has become my passion and my career, and has led me to be involved in a lot of different types of organizing spaces. I think the two I want to focus on most today are my work with PFLAG Dayton, as well as my work with Black and Pink. PFLAG Dayton is it's a national organization, and I was working specifically with the Dayton chapter. And it's an organization that provides support, education, and advocacy to members of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as their family and friends. And this is, I just always have to give my mom a shout out for this, because we were actually on the board together as a duo, where she would provide support to parents of trans kids, and I would work primarily with the trans folks, and providing that support to make sure that those individuals were receiving as much support from their community and their family as possible. And within that work, I found that a lot of folks in the queer community were experiencing sexual violence, but didn't feel like they had safe places to actually get the support and resources that they need. So I was able to work with folks in a peer support role to help folks access those resources, help facilitate trainings with partner agencies on how violence within the LGBTQ plus community can look different, and how therefore we need to provide different support within those spaces. And I also became really heavily involved with Black and Pink, which is a national prison abolitionist organization, supporting LGBTQ plus and HIV positive folks who are incarcerated. And this has a really heavy focus on mutual aid. So providing support through a pen pal program, distributing a prison written newspaper to incarcerated members, providing court accompaniment, as well as helping to educate people on their rights. And through this, I did not go into that work thinking that it was going to directly translate to sexual violence prevention and advocacy. But I found that all of the folks that I was interacting with, and obviously this is very anecdotal, I do not at this moment have the data to support this, but every person that I was interacting with was incarcerated as a direct result of unmitigated trauma from experiencing sexual violence in their childhood. And they weren't given the support and resources that they need to heal from that trauma. And through cycles of continued violence, ended up turning sometimes to substances in order to really help calm some of that hurt and the pain that they had experienced while not getting some of the support they needed to really heal in a meaningful way. So I was able to take what I had learned through my earlier organizing efforts to provide some of that support to folks who were incarcerated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. So we're coming up on time, but I do want to ask you one final question. You've been, as you've mentioned, doing work fighting for survivor justice for as long as I've known you, which I cannot believe has been a decade now, across many different states and communities. What do you now know that you wish you had known when you first started in your activism journey?
That is a great question. I would say that I have really adjusted my approach and my tone. I think at the time when I became involved in activism, had very recently experienced a fair amount of trauma myself. So I really brought a lot of anger and resentment into those spaces and really went in with the mindset of you're either with us or you're against us. And I would say that I can hold a lot of space for the younger version of me who took that approach. And as I've matured and developed, I've definitely moved more towards a movement building approach, recognizing that a lot of these really complex topics um, and topics, issues, and systems took me years to develop the understandings that I have today. And so, how am I able to give folks that I'm working with or potential allies the same space to develop some of those understandings? So, one of my favorite organizing tools is the spectrum of allies. So, really identifying I don't want to waste my time arguing with someone who is a really active opponent, who is really rooting their critiques or their input in hate like that. That isn't where my focus is. But how am I educating those people who were socialized in similar ways that I was and haven't had the access to information that would allow them to move through some of those older patterns of thinking and behavior into something that is more supportive and informed?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, meeting people where they're at and educating them with, for folks who have the best intentions is lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being on our panel. So I will kick it back to Erin before we jump into the Q&A portion.
Great, thank you. And just reminding folks that if you have questions for Emma or Elizabeth or Charlie or Jessica or myself for that matter, just put them in the Q&A tab and we'd love to see them. So encourage you to start getting those in now. Also got to put in a plug to plug into Repro Action campaigns. So here's the deal. We host these Act and Learn webinars every single month. They are free. They're open to the public. We always make a recording and share the recording, and a lot of people consume them that way or interact with them that way. We don't want you to miss them, and we want to invite you to them. So sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org, and then you don't have to worry. You're not going to miss a thing. So please get on our email list. We are on social media as Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever that is, and Instagram. And also just wanted to highlight some support resources that are available to you with a topic like this. Imagine we have a number of survivors who are watching. and listening. So support. So RAIN has a 24/7 help hotline. That's 800-656-HOPE. We've also got the link up to that up on the screen. Also, the National Women's Law Center Survivors Speaking Out Toolkit, which we also dropped in the chat, that Elizabeth worked on. And then also WINGS, which is for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So if you're watching this and you are a survivor, know that you're not alone, and that there are many organizations that are eager to provide support on your journey. And also want to encourage you to save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar. So in October, we're going to get together and we're going to talk about grassroots approaches to self-managed abortion education. So I'm super excited about that. Okay, going to move now to Q&A. So encourage folks to get questions in. I'm going to start with a question for Emma while we have those rolling in. Emma, in your biography, you talked about the linkages between survivor justice and reproductive justice. Would just love to hear you talk a little more about that.
Yeah. So reproductive justice kind of, just for the audience and anyone else, kind of focuses on the freedom to have a child and the freedom and choice to have a child, the freedom and choice not to have a child, and having a safe and healthy environment to raise and live children, or the choice to not have children. So I definitely think on that third tenet of reproductive justice, having that safe and healthy environment to live and raise children and raise yourself, I think that is where survivor justice comes in. Survivor justice and sexual violence are very pervasive and what makes a safe and healthy environment in any choice you choose. So in my case, like being a student and being able to thrive and fulfill a purpose at university and fulfill in my education, while also having the fulfillment of joy and happiness in whatever activities participate in, and having that idea of free from fear of sexual violence. We often talk about that in my student organizations, of like imagining and envisioning a place without fear of sexual violence. So I think that third tenet of reproductive justice and survivor justice really go hand in hand. As there's linkages between the other two as well, but that's kind of where I see it.
Thank you so much for fleshing that out for our listeners. Okay, my next question is for Elizabeth, and given Elizabeth, I love having your legal expertise on the line. So question for you, in light of the fact that the majority of cases of sexual assault are not reported, what's your wish list in terms of what do you wish was different under our current legal structure?
That's a great question, and I don't have time to say all the things in my wish list because there are so many, but I think one that's really important is just the way that schools are held accountable in our federal courts when they don't address sexual harassment and assault, and really all types of harassment, including harassment based on race and disability, national origin, ethnicity, and many other protected classes. So if you'll humor me, I'll just quickly, explain a little bit about how our courts currently see the situation. So right now, if you're a student and you've experienced harassment and you tell your school, please help me with this, your school doesn't really actually have to do very much in the eyes of federal courts. So in order for you to then go sue your school and say, you didn't help me and I'm entitled to damages, here's what you would have to prove. You'd have to prove that the harassment you experienced was severe and pervasive. And a number of different federal courts have said that forced kissing and groping isn't really severe. There's been a court that says oral rape is not actually severe because it wasn't vaginal rape. There's been a court that suggested, well, even vaginal rape, even if it's severe, it's not pervasive if it only happened one time. And this type of standard has also spilled over into race harassment cases, disability harassment cases. So that's the first hurdle that students have to overcome. A second hurdle is they have to show that they told the right person about it and that the school had what's considered actual notice of the harassment before they're liable for not addressing it. And the problem is different courts have said a number of different types of school employees are not the right person to know about the harassment. So across various different federal courts, they've said, well, you told the professor, but that doesn't count. You told the principal, that doesn't count. The teachers don't count. Athletics coaches don't count. Guidance counselors, bus drivers, superintendents, security guards, these people don't count. There was even one federal court that said the only person you can tell who is then going to make it an obligation for the school to help you is a school board member. But it's pretty ridiculous to expect anybody in K-12, especially young children, to go find their school board member and say, help me, I've been sexually harassed, assaulted, abused. And so, that's another hurdle to overcome. Then you have the part in the legal requirement that says the school has to have substantial control over the harassment. And what that really means is a lot of times courts will say, well, the incident happened off campus, and so the school didn't have control over it. So that means the school doesn't have to do anything about it. And this can apply even in situations where both the victim and the harasser are students or employees at the school. It could apply even if the incident took place 1 block outside of school grounds at a bar across the street from the university's, campus borders. And the court will say, well, it didn't happen, directly under the control of the school. The school doesn't have to do anything. And it gets even worse when you have 2 schools that are neighboring to each other. The students hang out a lot. And then both the schools say, well, neither of us had control over the situation. Neither of us owe you anything. And the victim has nowhere to go. Then you have another requirement, which says that in order to sue your school has to have responded with what's called deliberate indifference, which is a very high standard. It's okay if they respond unreasonably. It's only not okay if they respond clearly unreasonably to your report of harassment. And so that's just so hard for students to meet. To give you an example, there was a big case in a federal court where there were 3 Black sisters, and they experienced race-based harassment for more than a decade, including being called the N-word, finding a noose next to their car. And the court looked at all the evidence and said, yeah, these are all bad things that happened, but, the school did a couple things here and there. So even though the harassment didn't stop for more than 10 years, the school did not act with deliberate indifference. You don't have a case. There's a number of states where the students have to show they were harassed again after the school learned about the first incident of harassment. So that means if you were raped and you tell your school you were raped and they don't do anything about it, in some of these states, you don't have a case against your school unless you can show you were harassed or raped again. That's horrifying. And then last year, the Supreme Court ruled that there were, in disability case, that the plaintiffs in these disability cases couldn't sue for what's called emotional distress damages, that they couldn't sue to recover money just based off of the emotional harms they suffered. They would have to show other harms like a physical injury or, lost wages or other types of harm. And so that has spilled over from that disability case into Title IX cases in particular. And so that's really created a problem for victims of sexual assault who are students, and they might not be able to show any harms such as lost wages. Let's say they're 11 years old, they don't have any lost income. Or it might be a situation where they just don't have anything out of pocket they can prove. And so for a lot of these survivors, it means that they have no way to sue in court at all. So, the things that I just ran through here are really high hurdles that the various federal courts have created. They're not written in any law in our books, but they've just been court created. And so there is a solution to this. Congress can pass a bill called the SAFER Act, Students' Access to Freedom and Educational Rights, the SAFER Act. And what this would do is it would amend our federal civil rights laws to get rid of these hurdles so that schools are actually responsible for protecting their students from harassment, responding appropriately to harassment. And student victims of harassment don't have to face these extremely high hurdles in order to actually hold their schools accountable. And by passing this law, Congress would create a space where then students don't feel like it's not worth it for me to speak out because I'm just going to be punished for it, and the school doesn't have to do anything. And, it's just going to make my life worse than what it already is. So again, the SAFER Act, we have information about this on our website too. I'll share the link, but it's a bill that's been introduced in Congress, and we're hoping that, members of Congress can see the importance of passing a bill like this.
Thank you. Listening to you, Elizabeth, it was like, oh, it's almost as if the system is stacked against people while I was hearing that. And it's really helpful to hear, also with the impulse of there ought to be a law. So that's great to hear about the SAFER Act, and we'll be thrilled to share that information forward in our follow-up email with this recording. Thank you. Okay, I'm also going to ask Charlie. I was quite moved by your description of your multi-generational activism with your mother. And just would love to hear any additional thoughts you have on the importance and benefits of multi-generational activism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when Jessica asked the question about what do you wish you knew then when you first started your activism journey, I would say this has also been one of the really key points in my personal development. I think that young folks will always have fresh and innovative ways to address some of these systems of oppression. And it is so important to do that in partnership with folks who have already been involved in movement building work for many decades. Because, sometimes we don't understand why an approach was taken the way that it was, and we need to understand that context in order to continue to build and develop more innovative new approaches. But I think there's also a bit of a culture of leaving elders within movement building work behind because we start to see their ideas and beliefs as outdated. So continuing to create those communities of connection and support because that insight is still really valid and has informed all of the ways we were able to engage in this work now. So really honoring and respecting all of the work and the trials and tribulations elders in this work have had to experience in order to make our involvement possible in the first place.
Thank you for that. I want to thank all of our panelists because this has just been an outstanding and terrific discussion. So Charlie, thank you for that. I mean, that's just a note of hope and further food for thought for me. Elizabeth, outstanding, and also Emma as well. And last, certainly not least, this webinar would not have happened without our absolutely fabulous digital outreach and opposition research director, Jessica Ensley. Jessica, thank you for all of the care and expertise that you brought into pulling this together and for bringing together this absolutely dynamite panel. So deep appreciation to all of you for your work, solidarity with survivors who are listening to this now or in the future as a recording. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you again. Have a good one.